welcome and congratulations on the book.
Hey, Richard, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you today.
So let's dive in. You say the superpower, and that's us here in the United States, is in peril. But of course, we still got lots of allies. We have the world's biggest economy, the largest defense budget. It could go on. So what's the peril? What's the peril that you see?
Well, I think by just about any measure, America's in decline. So if you look economically, you see $31 trillion of debt. You see record high inflation, highest in 40 years. But probably most significantly, you see that if you're born in the fourth quartile, harder than even in any time in the post-World War II period to get to the third quartile, the second quartile, really the essence of the American dream. In a national security context, we're being challenged by a rival, a threat in China, both militarily and economically. And spiritually, there's some basic building blocks of American exceptionalism, merit, our capitalist system, that are being chipped away. And that's why, to some alarming statistics, 80% of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. 2/3 think their kids are going to be less well off than they are. And so we're in decline, but the essence of the book is decline's a choice. And so is renewal. It depends on what we do. And so what the book is attempting to do is lay out a vision, a roadmap for what we should do by educating our people, by confronting China, and really securing America.
You have a PhD in international relations, so you know well that fears of American decline have a long pedigree in post-World War II thought. Periodically, the policymaking class has been convinced that the United States is kind of on the road to perdition, whether it was after Sputnik, during the Vietnam War, during the Carter era malaise, and each time the United States came roaring back. So do you see this time as different to those times, or is the question just whether and how we're going to come roaring back?
Well, the book is ominous because it's got that superpower and peril, big red, bold letters. But the book's actually an optimistic book. And it's optimistic for the reasons that you said, which is the American tradition is we get to the edge of the cliff and we pull ourselves back. And I actually lived through this. I'm much older than you, Richard. I lived through this in 1979. So I was 14, 15. And I remember, we were at 15, 16% inflation. The economy was in recession. We had gas lines around the block. Those were the days you had odd days or even days to get gas. I remember sitting in the gas line. My dad had the Country Squire, which was a station wagon with wood on the sides. It was about a half a block long. We had Desert One, where in an attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran, there was a failed military mission. We lost 8 service members. It reminds me a lot of what happened in Afghanistan. It was a humiliation, a national humiliation. And 80% of Americans, about 80% of Americans thought the country was headed in the wrong direction in 1979. 1983, I'm at West Point. I'm walking along those beautiful pathways looking on the Hudson Valley, and America's back. The economy's on fire. Inflation's in check. We're in the middle of a military buildup that ends the Cold War 6 years later without a shot, and it was morning in America. And so that story gives me optimism because with sound policies and good leadership under Ronald Reagan, I try to make this case in the book, we turn the country around. So yes, I believe that there's a path to renewal. I try to lay out what my belief is in terms of the policies and the leadership we need, but it's not preordained. We could really screw this up, and so the book hopefully encourages people not to do that.
We'll get to some of the specific proposals that you have here in just a minute, but how do you account for how we got to the place that you describe?
Well, it's a compounding, certainly a compounding set of errors. Many of them bipartisan. Some of them, I think, particularly, I try to outline, were particularly problematic in the last couple years under the Biden administration. I think America's role in the world, leadership in the world, the thing that was really the catalyst for me running for office was the debacle in Afghanistan, which to me was really a sign of incompetence and weakness that I think has been a source of encouragement for Putin's invasion into Ukraine and some of the other adventurism we see around the world. So I think that's a problem. On an economic perspective, we've had decades of fiscal imprudence where we've spent beyond our means, and then we've had more than a decade of easy monetary policy. And what that did, and that's been bipartisan, I think the spending has spiked dramatically under President Biden, but that's been bipartisan. And what that's done is really something I saw on the campaign trail, and it goes to this point on the American dream. So, if you've had assets over the last 10 years, you got richer. You didn't have to be smarter. You just got richer if you had a house or stocks or bonds or whatever it was. But 90% of Americans don't have assets. In fact, 75% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And so the economic policies have been advantageous to a small few. And for the rest of the country, real income has remained the flat. And inflation is particularly problematic for working families or people on fixed income. So the economic model that's been at the core of American dynamism really hasn't worked very well. And I think that's one of the underlying reasons for the polarization we have and the lack of productivity. And that's one of the things I try to address with the policies I'm recommending in the book.
When you look at the political class now, I mean, do you see a sufficient level of debate, a constructive debate about where to go, particularly on some of these issues like the debt, which seems to be something that politicians sort of have as a ritual incantation? The debt is too high, but then that doesn't preclude them from increasing spending and potentially also reducing tax revenue, which is, last time I checked, how you get a debt. So, I mean, do you have faith at all in the way things are going right now, or is it still need to be kind of a real catalytic moment where we get serious about addressing these things?
Well, I don't have faith at the moment, no. I think that there's two things. There's sort of a meaningful debate that needs to happen within the country about the right policies.
Yeah.
There's different visions, competing visions. There's different visions between the progressives and conservatives. And I try to lay out the intellectual argument for conservative policy. But then there's a real debate within the conservative movement between the forces of populism and traditional conservatism, traditional republicanism. And I try to lay out the path, which I think the country should lead us forward in the Republican Party, and I hope in the country. And it's essentially to acknowledge that some of the traditional conservative policies haven't worked, and that a big chunk of America hasn't been the beneficiary of it. And I try to lay out that the populist pulse, there's some wisdom in it. The fact that globalization hasn't given us the security we need as a country, it also hasn't given us the economic benefit, at least for some parts of our population. So I try to lay out an economic agenda, a policy agenda that reflects traditional conservatism, small government and free markets and American leadership and exceptionalism in the world, but also recognizes that some of those things haven't been working. Some of the traditional policies haven't been working, and recommends a new set of policies that hopefully will address some of those underlying dynamics of decline. And so first is the idea. So that's where I try to focus the conversation, because I think we have a real debate. But then second, we have a high degree of polarization, where people aren't able to sit down and have a meaningful debate about ideas. And we're not going to get very far if we can't actually argue, constructively agree and disagree about the path for the country. And that's a real problem. And I don't have answers to it, unfortunately. But what I do say in the book is that, listen, part of that is we don't have shared experiences. And I use the military as one example. I'm not suggesting everybody needs to have military service. But in 1950, 80% of the members of Congress had served in the military. Today, it's 17%. And that makes a difference, because that shared experience. I served in the 82nd Airborne Division. In my platoon, I had a Southern Baptist from Alabama, a black man from Newark, and a platoon sergeant from Puerto Rico who was 35 and I was 22, and he was like ancient. And I never remember debating politics. I don't even know who was what in terms of Republicans and Democrats. That shared experience created common trust, common purpose, common mission. We don't have those ways to bind us together in the country today. And so that's why I've been a strong public supporter of national service, because national service is great in terms of that patriotic experience you get, but it also binds us together. And so I don't know what the answer is on the polarization, other than to say shared experiences, a common appreciation for America. What we teach in schools about the exceptional role of America in the world, I think, is part of it. There needs to be a comprehensive way to try to beat down some of those forces of polarization, because we're not going We're not going to move forward without them. We've had moments of history where that spiked. We're in such a moment, and we need to overcome it.
Part of the rationale that you articulate for why we need American renewal or national renewal is essentially the world's not standing still and China's on the rise. So how does China in particular fit into the way you understand America's position today and this need for renewal?
Well, the challenge we face is both within and without, or outside. So within, it's those forces that I described. The decisions, the choices we made have weakened us, and both spiritually as well as, we could talk about the spiritual piece as well as economically and from a security perspective. And so there's a whole part of the book that argues for going to the gym. We need to go back to the gym, build muscle, and create the policies and the underlying building blocks of America's trade. But the second part of the challenge is we have an existential threat in the form of China. And, there was a bipartisan consensus 20 years ago that we needed to bring China into the international economic community. By doing so, we create reciprocity and access to Chinese markets, be great economically for the United States. We'd also, we thought, dampen some of the more aggressive tendencies of China. We'd have a more benign China, ultimately a China that might even become more democratic with time. And that's not happened. That bet has failed. And what we have instead was not reciprocity. We had an economic model that was disadvantageous to the United States. We had enormous intellectual property theft, which has been the undergirding of China's technological rise. We had the buildup of a very significant Chinese military, and particularly under President Xi, we've had a geopolitical rival that's been advancing on the global stage in a way that's challenging America's role in the world. And if you had any question of whether that's true or not, just go to the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times a couple weeks ago, where in the same week we had President Xi in Moscow supporting Putin's advances into Ukraine, and we had the Chinese foreign minister in the Gulf brokering the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So that is what we're dealing with on the global stage, and we're dealing with that at a moment where we've not built the strength at home, but we've created enormous dependencies on China for semiconductors, or in the region close to China for semiconductors and global supply chains. And so we need a strategy to confront China. And in a nutshell, I argue for strategic decoupling, bringing home or in our immediate sphere of influence key industries that matter to America's economic vitality, but also its national security. I argue for putting investment restrictions in place that stop Silicon Valley firms from investing in artificial intelligence companies that do business with the PLA or the Communist Party. I argue for a set of alliances around the world that will strengthen a pivot to China in diplomatic terms that strengthen our ability to check Chinese aggression. And finally, I argue for a much more aggressive accountability for Chinese misbehavior. For example, COVID emanating from Wuhan, the lack of cooperation, transparency, and so forth. So that's the agenda. It starts at home, but it's also confronting China abroad.
Yeah, I'm really curious. So when you have been talking to voters in Pennsylvania, presumably when you talk about China, or if they talk about China, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would suspect they're not, worried about the rules-based international order or, Chinese land reclamation and militarization of features in the South China Sea, or some of these other things that kind of keep people up at night in Washington. And there are costs associated with some of the proposals that you've proposed and that would be necessary to sort of renew ourselves and be stronger against China. So what is the threat that either they identify or that you identify when you're talking to folks that would in turn justify the kinds of costs or expenditures or changes that you have in mind?
Well, I think there is a growing awareness of China's challenge to America on the global stage. The Chinese surveillance balloon, for example, I think was a big example. Wait a second here. This has real ramifications at home and for American interest abroad. But it's mostly at this moment, at least in my experience, economic. Mm-hmm. So you sort of have people that have been, we talked about globalization and open markets, and there's two truisms. One is that globalization has been beneficial to the U.S. economy writ large, but has been very detrimental in concentrated ways to certain parts of our communities and economies. And I saw that across rural Pennsylvania, even urban Pennsylvania, the manufacturing base really gutted by globalization. So you have sort of two sets of business people or just citizens you talk to. There are those who say, wait a second, that really disadvantaged us. We need to bring manufacturing home, particularly high-paying manufacturing jobs that are going to be necessary for America's economic benefit, but also national security. But then you also have huge industries that are dependent on China. So I remember this vividly. In one single day, I'm in York, in Pennsylvania, York, Pennsylvania, and I go to a manufacturing plant, and I'm talking to them, and they want to make sure we're putting appropriate restrictions on China, steel tariffs, because their business is being undermined by China's lowballing in steel in the steel industry, and they want to stop the predatory behavior of China. That's one stop. A next stop, I go to a Harley-Davidson supplier that builds the racks for the back of the bikes that get exported to China, and they said, wait a second, don't be stupid on China. That's our biggest growing market. And so, to do this well, to set this policy well, I think you need to recognize both things are true. And the way I argue in the book, we need to have concentric circles. There's a set of things that must be done at home. The semiconductor industry should be based at home. Pharmaceuticals should be based at home. There's concentric circles of things that we might put with our closest allies, where we have confidence we'll never be disadvantaged, we won't lose access. And then further and further concentric circles out. And China is in the third or fourth concentric circle, in the sense that no problem if we want to sell Harley-Davidson motorcycles, at least in my opinion. Decoupling, it's going to take a while, but it has to start with a clear vision. And one of my critiques of the Biden administration would be that I think they say two things: investment restrictions and strategic decoupling, which I agree with. But the actual energy and action behind that, at least up until this point, has not been entirely evident to me.
So is this where your approach to, industrial policy and some of these other economic policies that would do things like reshoring or bifurcating the US-China technology supply chain, some of these things differ from what has been traditionally thought of as industrial policy, where the government would sort of figure out what are the industries of the future that we want to have at home as opposed to abroad, because it'll generate disproportionate returns, and so we'll sort of throw some money or some subsidies at that. What you're talking about is stemming from a national security position and saying, well, there's national security risks that are not being priced in by the market, and so the government has to step in order to protect our national security.
National security risk, and also sort of zero-sum dynamics around some of these technologies. So there was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal 4 or 5 weeks ago, Richard, about an Australian think tank that had done an analysis of 44 critical technologies, critical from an economic perspective, critical from a national security perspective. This independent think tank concluded that China was in the lead in 37 of the 44. So they have a techno-authoritarian model. It could both be not sustainable over the next 2 or 3 decades, and at the moment, creating huge advantage to China, certainly created huge advantages in heavily subsidized areas like semiconductors. And so what I'm arguing for is as follows. First, we need to maintain leadership in those core technologies for America's exceptional role in the world, for all the reasons I've said. To address decline, key to that is having technological leadership. But our current policies aren't creating that. And so there's sort of 3 things I highlight. One is a doubling down on basic R&D. And the Biden administration has done some of this, but to put it in perspective, we're about 50% of what we were in 1950 as a percentage of GDP. So that's the one area where the market's not going to create the right investment, and that's critical to our future. The second thing is we need to have policies that are drawing private capital to the industries that have such consequence, artificial intelligence and so forth. And I'm not arguing for a China model. I say explicitly, we can't out-China China in terms of state-owned enterprises and capital subsidies. And I'm not arguing for a traditional industrial policy. In other words, I don't want the government giving money to company A, B, and C in the semiconductor industry, which is one of the critiques I have on the CHIPS Act, although I appreciate the sentiment behind it. But what I'm trying to suggest is creating policies, either through tax breaks or side-by-side capital investment, to draw private capital into the areas that matter most. And the Chinese, interestingly enough, have experimented with this. So an example would be, if you thought we were underinvested in artificial intelligence solutions that are going to support our national security, then you might create an artificial intelligence fund working side by side with the private sector, where private capital and government capital work side by side. But then to make it more attractive, you would have the government take first loss, and you would cap the government's returns. So private sector investment private sector investors get a juiced up return if in fact they're successful. And then those same private sector forces allocate the capital to the companies, the management teams, the opportunities that they think are most attractive. In doing so, you sort of get the best of our dynamic capitalist system, and you also get a little bit of finger on the scale in terms of drawing private capital in the right area. There's lots of risk. I say this with trepidation, because there's a slippery slope of getting the government involved. So I try to lay out principles that should guide how we do this. And I say, there's a piece in there where you may have remembered, Richard, where I said, what would Milton Friedman say? Yeah, and the answer is Milton Friedman would disagree with these policies. And if you're a card-carrying Republican conservative like me, you say, wow, Milton Friedman will be opposed to this. But when I dissect it, I basically say, I don't think Milton Friedman has good answers to the fact that these technologies are critical to the future of the world, and certainly America's role in the world, and we're losing the battle because the playing field's not fair. And so I'm trying to take the best of our system for allocating capital, our dynamic way of ensuring that profitability drives the allocation of capital in pursuit of the profit, which is what's made our system so dynamic, combined with the recognition that all technologies are not created equal. And there's some areas where there's huge national benefit of being on the leadership side of these things.
So that's, I mean, for what it's worth, it seems to me that there is a conservative economic argument precisely behind what you're describing, because it comes from, if you really want to geek out over this stuff, there's a market failure because the benefit of having some of these industries here for our national security is not priced in, and that, the cost, nor is the cost when they're overseas and so forth. And so maybe even Milton Friedman, in maybe some, if you caught him at the right moment, would acknowledge the role of government in something like this. But just to go back for a second to the issue you're talking about, say manufacturing in manufacturing towns in Pennsylvania and other places. I mean, those manufacturing jobs have been lost to China, but they've also been lost to automation. Yeah. It's also not clear that that if those manufacturing jobs, if we sort of embargo China, that they would come back to Pennsylvania as opposed to another lower wage cost country. So is your approach also on that kind of pure economic side to say we need to bring all those manufacturing jobs back to the same places they used to be? Or no,
there's a part in the book which is sort of a metaphor for where I think we need to go, which I lived in Pittsburgh for 10 years. So when I came out of the Army, I went back to graduate school on the GI Bill, and then I went to Pittsburgh, and I ran a company in Pittsburgh. And on the weekends, I had little kids at the time, I would run through Pittsburgh. We lived in the city. And I describe running over through Shenley Park, and you look down on the Monongahela River, and you see these skeletons of these amazing steel mills that were there. It was sort of the heart of industrial America. And we're not going to bring those steel mills back. That's not what I'm recommending. I'm not what I'm suggesting. We couldn't do it if we wanted to. But then I run back on the latter half of the run through Oakland and through University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and through Carnegie Mellon. And there you see the future. Robotics. You see that Apple and Uber and Google have all put these huge centers there. There's an artificial intelligence center there where next generation technology is being manufactured that's creating great jobs for Pennsylvanians. And these aren't just high-paying, PhD from Carnegie Mellon jobs. These are jobs where skilled workers are really required. So one part of the book I talk about is not everybody needs to get a 4-year degree, but there could be really terrific technical skills training. So the GI Bill could also pay for 2 years degrees in, electronics and things like that are part of ensuring that we rebuild our economic model, but also the American dream for others. So we need to have that next generation technology be at the core of our communities, and that's going to require a lot of education and retooling to be able to do that. So our future is a different future than our past, but it's grounded in some of those same basic principles of skilled workers, gritty Americans, kind of making the most of their lives by dedicating themselves to building what America needs for the future.
I mean, that seems to me a remarkably honest answer and appraisal. I wonder how have you seen this play politically? Because of course there are folks out there who say, no, somebody stole those jobs, and if you elect me, I'll bring them all back. And if they don't, then they say the reason I haven't yet is because someone else there is screwing you. But don't worry, I'm fighting to bring all those jobs back. We're going to return your economic situation to precisely what it was when you liked it the most, as opposed to what you are describing, which is some of those days are gone, but there's a better future if we make the right policy decisions for everybody. Yeah. So what are the politics of that like?
We'll see. I mean, the book.
Okay, fair enough.
We will see. One of the things that was, I guess, is the reality of politics, but everything's 30 seconds. Everything, you're answering your questions in 30 seconds. You don't get a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And so, I was on the campaign trail, the feedback I get periodically from my team, and particularly Dina, my wife, would be, okay, professor, stop with the 2-minute answers, right? You got to answer. But these problems are actually really complex problems. And, we need policies that are new to reflect our new reality, but they're grounded in some basic notions that what makes America special is the entrepreneurial spirit, the grit, the dynamism of the American worker, the American entrepreneur. So we got to sort of stay true to the core of things that have made America everything that it is, and also reflect with policies and leadership that reflects the new reality. And so that's going to be a messy process getting to that politically. I certainly experienced that in my own race, but I think it's ultimately where we need to go.
Yeah. That actually raises another question I wanted to ask you when you're talking about kind of what is the core of America and all of this. And it gets back to the US-China competition. So there's some folks, at least in the foreign policy world, that look at the US-China competition. They say, look, this is a contest of power, of a rising power and an established power, and there's not really an ideological component. This is not a contest of our democracy versus their autocracy or our freedom versus their dictatorship. You seem to take precisely the opposite approach. You've talked a lot about American exceptionalism, not just in the book, but in your previous writings, the importance of our values in our foreign policy and sort of what we stand for and what we are at home. So how do you see that aspect of this competition?
Well, let me start with the American piece of that. So I do think the American system is exceptional. I think we're unique in the history of the world in terms of the results, the freedom it's brought to people, the economic lifting billions of people out of poverty, the role it's played in the world in terms of confronting aggression and Nazism and so forth. And, President Obama had that great line at one point in a speech he gave where, the Greeks think they're exceptional and the British think they're exceptional. We, of course, think we're exceptional. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think objectively, and this isn't like a chest-beating patriotism, I think that the history would show that despite very dark chapters that we need to confront and learn from, that America has been, has made unique contribution to the world. That does not mean that I'm saying everybody has to adopt the American model. I'm not projecting. I think our system of freedom and individual rights and all of those things have made America special. And I think we should promote those ideals and freedom around the world. But I don't say that with arrogance. I say that by setting the example of what our system has been able to do and create and confront its many mistakes. I think China's model is confronting America's interest abroad, and I think challenging some basic premises of our model. It's certainly encouraging other allies around the world to adapt a Chinese ideology, a way of thinking about the world that is in many ways in conflict with U.S. interest. So I think there is a different ideological approach. There's a very different view of the world, a very different view of human rights, a techno-authoritarian model versus a modern republic. At the same time, I don't think the answer is to try to make China the United States. I think the answer is to promote U.S. values and interest abroad and confront China's aggression in ways that wherever it confronts and challenges U.S. interest.
We'll talk in just a second about some of the specifics, some of your proposals. I want to get into the talent and the technology and the data and things like that. But maybe just a last question about kind of the politics of this, again, because you've spent so much time on the ground and talking to voters and so forth. When you talk to folks about the aspects of the China challenge that are not related to economics and jobs and things like that, Taiwan and the threat to Taiwan, or the extinguishing of democracy in Hong Kong, things like that. How do people think about, or how do you articulate the stakes for Americans? I mean, I guess the real question is, why should Americans care about democracy in Hong Kong and whether it exists or not, or Taiwan's de facto independence, or whether that exists or not, and things like that China's doing that are not in the economic sphere?
Well, I think it should reflect on our interest, and we sort of try to make this case when offered the opportunity. I think it's in our interest to promote the values that we hold dear around individual liberty and freedom, and the benefits that brings to society, and our recognition that we want to support those principles around the world, which is different than necessarily intervening in conflict around the world to promote those principles. And so that's an area open for debate. So I'm one who thinks that we should promote and very explicitly call out the way we think things should be, but be very careful about expending U.S. power in pursuit of things that aren't directly in America's interest. And this is a debate that's happening in American foreign policy today. I do believe that democracy in Hong Kong and independence for Taiwan are directly in America's interest. And I think the reason they are is that we're a global country. We have global interest. The Pacific, we're a Pacific country. We have significant interest in the Pacific. And if you have an expansionist China, a techno-authoritarian model that's gobbling up territory and growing influence, military and economic, that directly confronts America's interests. So I think we have a real stake in Taiwan's independence. We have a real stake in Hong Kong and China's ambition in Asia because it's in our national interest. It's also in pursuit of those values, but first and foremost, it's in our hard interest.
There's a couple questions from the audience that let me throw at you, and before we go on to some of the specifics of your proposals. So Jeffrey asks, how should we approach our relationship with Saudi Arabia now that China is brokering agreements between them and Iran?
Well, listen, I think what's happening, and I'm sure some of your listeners, some of the participants here may disagree with this. I think that when our allies are uncertain that they can count on America, when they're uncertain that America is going to have their back, then those allies are going to hedge. They're going to look for other alternatives. I think that's what's happening in the Gulf. I think that's what's happening with the Emirates. I think it's happening in Saudi Arabia. I think they've lost confidence. I think the Saudis have lost confidence that America is the ally that they believed it was. This is someone who lived for almost a year in Saudi Arabia, was part of the first Gulf War. That relationship has been a strong one. We have differences on human rights, and I don't mean to minimize any of that, but that's been a stalwart relationship that I think is in question. I think it's in question because of what happened in Afghanistan. I think it's in question on the part of the Emirates and the Saudis and others because of the deal with Iran. And I think that's what's happening. I think you have hedging. And so what do you do when that's happening? Well, those interests to continue to have strong relationships in the Gulf are still very much in the U.S. interest. And I think, we should continue to build those relationships, build those alliances, recognizing we're not going to agree with everybody on everything. And that's the reality of geopolitics today. And I think we should acknowledge it.
There's a question from John. I'm going to rephrase it slightly so it's not completely leading the witness here, but maybe should hedge funds decouple from China? They've invested billions of dollars there.
Well, investment restrictions, I think we absolutely need to have investment restrictions. And the free flow of investment from U.S. investors to China, I think, needs to be under very strict review. This is something that I talked about a lot in the campaign. It's something I addressed in the book. My history had been, I was at Bridgewater. Bridgewater had about 2% of its capital invested in China. But if you're a $160 billion fund, that's not an immaterial amount of money. And that's something we talked about and wrestled with. As a first step, I think we absolutely need to stop, restrict all investments that are in direct support of the Chinese military, the Communist Party. So what I recommend in the book is a reverse CFIUS, where we're reviewing those sorts of investments and putting appropriate constraints on it. And then I think we need to just look like, that same process I described on trade, where we have those concentric circles. I think there's probably a similar process that we need to do with investment. And the principles that would guide that for me would be anything that creates dependency on China from a U.S. perspective, anything that aids China in the rise of its military or its Communist Party, I would be opposed to. Now, of course, dollars are fungible, so one has to think about that in a very smart way. But I think it's very difficult right now from a U.S. economic interest to completely stop all trade investment. And so I think we need to go into that with a clear North Star of our national security interests being paramount, and then go from there.
Okay, so one of your, I should say, maybe the centerpiece of the kind of policy agenda you lay out is what you call talent. So what is that? I mean, I think we know what talent is, broadly speaking, but what do you mean by talent, and why is that the centerpiece?
Well, I think it comes back to what's made America special. And what's made America special is that a system that's allowed for individual freedom and initiative, combined with the uniquely entrepreneurial and spirit and grit of the American people. And so I think we need to unlock that. One of the challenges I outline in Decline is that opportunity, equality of opportunity for everybody to rise based on their ability and their hard work is becoming more and more difficult. And one of the reasons it's become more difficult is we don't have adequate education that can be offered to all. And that disadvantages all Americans, but it really disadvantages minorities, blue collar Americans, because if you're rich or middle class, you can figure out alternatives to make sure your kids get a great education. So there's three pieces to the talent argument I make. First is we need to adopt and really fundamentally change our education model with school choice. This has been the conservative ring the bell for decades, but we're at a moment where it's actually happening. And what happened during COVID, which was obviously a tragedy on many levels, is parents got to look over the shoulder at their kids and they saw what was happening in the schools. The history of America that was being taught, not an accurate portrayal of America's history in many places. That's not to say we shouldn't talk about dark chapters, but we have to look at America in its totality. Our kids can't be taught that they should be ashamed of America. And that's really important. And I'll come back to that because I think it affects why you see surveys around patriotism and military volunteerism and so forth in decline. But we also are 22nd in the world in terms of math, science, and engineering among industrialized countries. Our school system is by any measure failing. And so this is a moment where I think, and I heard this on the campaign trail, you've got parents running for school board, you have governors across the country putting in school choice in Arkansas and Florida. This is a moment where I think we have an opportunity to really fundamentally change our school model to make sure that students and achievement is the highest order. The second thing I argue is around skills training. And we have a philosophy, I grew up with it, where the path to success was a 4-year degree. I grew up in the home of 2 teachers. But for many Americans, that's not necessarily the case. We could have great skills training, great jobs and opportunity and advancement and income, and we have huge gaps. I heard this on the campaign trail over and over again, whether it's the fracking industry or manufacturing. There's not adequate skilled workers. So we have this mismatch of opportunity and the workers to fill that opportunity, and that is the path to the American dream. That's one of the great historical facts of Pittsburgh is the middle class existence that people had in the heyday of Pittsburgh was incredible. And then the third thing I argue for, which is a very controversial topic these days, is I argue for really strong enforcement of the border and quelling this illegal immigration. It's a disaster. I've visited, I've looked at the numbers. It's killing Pennsylvanians because of the fentanyl crisis and the fentanyl that comes across the border. There's all sorts of ways that that's problematic. But in pursuit of stopping illegal immigration, we can't lose the fact that legal immigration is really critical to America's future. And so I make an argument for skilled immigration and a reform of our immigration system to ensure that that becomes the third leg of the stool of our talent system to ensure that America remains at the forefront economically and technologically.
Can you just say one more word about that, about the high-skilled immigration part and what the path through? So is this folks who are coming to be educated here in high technology areas that would like to stay and contribute to the economy, but for immigration reasons might have to go home? We should make it possible for them to stay?
Yeah,
Other thing.
Possibly, but Canada, many countries, but Canada is a good example.
Yeah.
Has a system that is much more skills focused, skills based. And listen, you're confronted with the challenge with all our discussion of decline and all the things that are wrong with America. There's millions of people that would give anything to be here tomorrow. So we're confronted with how do we construct a legal immigration system that reflects our values and also reflects our needs and what's going to help America continue to be exceptional in every way. And I'm arguing for a much more skills-based that draws people from that pool of potential legal immigrants that are going to help also meet America's needs going forward. And as I said, there's a number of industrialized countries that have such a path, such a plan. We don't have such a plan, and I think that would go a long way. And by the way, that if we do that well, that's not coming at the expense of American workers. Quite the reverse. That's creating further opportunity for American workers because legal immigrants have played such a role in building America's innovation ecosystem.
I was just going to remind folks who are tuning in, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to some more of those. So you've got sort of three on your renewal agenda. The talent portion of that makes a ton of sense. The technology, I think, is also very intuitive. The third one is maybe less so, that's data. So what does data have to do with American renewal?
Data is probably the most important thing we rarely talk about. So data is at the core of innovation. Data is at the core of our security, both individual and national. There was an Economist cover last year that said data is the new oil, but it's actually much more important than oil, or than oil was in its oil's heyday, because data is non-rival, which means, which a word economists use, you can use it over and over again. And data is at the core of this next generation of remarkable technologies, artificial intelligence and so forth. And this is an area where China's techno-authoritarian model, its top-down control, in many ways gives it an advantage because it has access to all data, right? It has access to data and how data is used and so forth. And so I'm first of all highlighting, hey, data is a big deal. We do not have adequate privacy protections for our data in the United States. It unsettles me, and so I suspect it unsettles you, when I order a pair of sneakers online and for the next 6 months I get advertisements every month for new sneakers, right? Who knows where your data goes? You're supposed to check a box and it releases you. Your data is everywhere. So first of all, there's no personal control of your data. Second, data is at the core of innovation. The reason we had such success in accelerating the rollout of vaccines in dealing with COVID was because the pharmaceutical companies, with the exception of the Chinese, by the way, shared all their data. And that allowed for a very quick turn on innovation. And so the data is at the core of CRISPR. The data is at the core of everything that's happening from an innovation perspective. And then finally, the data has huge implications for how we shape the attitudes of Americans. And this is where I talk about social media. And social media is, I think, by any objective measure, fairly one-sided in terms of the marketplace of ideas. And that's really problematic because American citizens who are increasingly accessing social media aren't getting access to the full range of possibilities. I'm not arguing for conservative social media. I'm arguing for balanced social media. And so I think we need to do things to curb and create accountability for social media companies in terms of what's being projected in social media. Now, all of this is another example of where I'm a small government, conservative, low taxes, and all of a sudden I'm saying the government needs to be more involved in big tech, which I acknowledge. I think there are certain areas where the government needs to play a more consequential role, carefully, not a slippery slope, because the consequences of not doing so are so significant. And so data is a big deal. China has a plan for data, just like China has a plan for supremacy, and we don't have a plan.
The Wall Street Journal had an article a couple of weeks ago looking at the most used apps in the United States, and of the 5 most downloaded apps in the United States from Apple's App Store in last month, in March 2023, 4 of the 5 were Chinese.
Yeah.
1 was American, Facebook, but it was TikTok and some of these other ones. So on the one hand, Americans find value in this. They like these things. They would like to use these things. On the other hand, these are Chinese apps that get, among other things, right at the data issue that you just described. So how do you think about that, given how white hot this issue of should we ban TikTok, and is TikTok just the beginning, or what does that look like?
Well, I think TikTok is just the beginning, and I think we have to look at this issue in 2 dimensions at least. One is the actual national security implications of that data, access to that data, what that means. So of course there's a question that's being debated on whether the Chinese actually have access to the TikTok data. My presumption is that they do, and that has huge consequences for a lot of understanding. In many ways we probably don't even know. For example, I cite in the book the fact that in Afghanistan the Chinese were able to get access to the Fitbit data of the soldiers, which gave them all sorts of information about what the units were doing in Afghanistan. So having access to that data, government officials, who knows all the different ways, I think that poses a genuine national security risk that needs to be addressed. And I'm talking about TikTok, but I'm suspecting we're talking about a broader issue than just TikTok. The second thing that's happening is what social media and TikTok in general does to our kids. And I think this is largely the role of parents, not the government. But I find it interesting, as an example, that the Chinese severely limit the access Chinese children have to TikTok, an hour a day or something like that, where our children are using TikTok, more than 100 million users for most of the day. And what that does culturally, what that does socially, what that does to the next generation is really unknown, but can't be good. And so that's a second concern. And I think one needs to tread carefully here, because we also need to protect, on the other hand, civil liberties and all the freedoms that make America special. But we're in uncharted territory here, and I think we need to proceed with a lot of risk management and understanding that the consequences of this new way of communicating, new technology could be quite severe.
Yeah, totally. There's a question from Robert who asks, how should we proceed with Ukraine? Should we keep funding arms or redirect that money elsewhere? So you want to wade into that debate?
Well, it's hard not to. It's hard not to. My view on this is that what's happened in Ukraine is clear. We had, significant aggression on the part of Putin, and that we should be strong supporters of helping Ukraine overcome that aggression and protect the liberty and freedom of the Ukrainian people. I think we should do that because it's in our interest to do that. We're supportive of freedom, but we're not sending our military capability to Ukraine because we're in love of freedom, although we are. It's because to let Putin go unchecked into Ukraine, to succeed, to be able to potentially challenge other parts of NATO or Europe, and to do that for all the world to see, including China, would be fundamentally against, in my opinion, U.S. interests. But let me say a second thing. So yes, I think we should support them and support them fully and enable them to win. We can debate what that means to do. I'm not sure I'm the expert on the best way to help them with our support. But the second thing I think we need to acknowledge is there's a big chunk of America that disagrees. And why do they disagree? And I saw this on the campaign trail in Pennsylvania. They disagree because they're tired of 20 years of war. They saw their sons and daughters in these small communities come up. By the way, most of them came from the 4th quartile and 3rd quartile. They didn't come from most of the people in Washington and New York and on the Acela corridor. and they're tired of the damage that did to their kids, to their communities. They saw the corruption. They saw the grocery carts being wheeled out of Bagram Air Force Base with military radios in them. They're not confident that U.S. treasure won't be corrupted and used by others in ways. They don't have full confidence. And so as I stand here and say we should support Ukraine, we need to acknowledge that concern and why it's a concern, and we need to address it and say, no, here's the accountability we're going to have. And no, we're not going to let U.S. forces get dragged into this directly or indirectly. We need to put the right constraints around it, because ultimately the American people aren't going to support it unless we do so, and their concerns are grounded in a lot of very real experience.
Well, and you fought in the Gulf War with another, an example of when the United States similarly discerned an interest in resisting state-on-state aggression. We did so in a very different way, but had we not, the consequences could have been quite profound in ways that were even difficult, I think, to imagine at the time. So,
right,
yeah.
Absolutely.
You talk in the book about what you call a rebirth of leadership, and you've talked in this conversation a little bit about what that might look like at the governmental level. What about the business level? I mean, what seems so striking to me is, particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but now with the China competition heating up, particularly in the economic and business dimension, there are all these kind of geopolitical questions and national security questions that are facing business leaders. And that's even before you get to what effect are things like social media having on our children and all these other kinds of things. So, coming out of the business sector, what's the role of a responsible leader in business on some of these issues?
Well, I think I'd part company with many of my former CEO friends and colleagues on this point. First of all, I understand the temptation to speak out and get drawn into these debates, but I mostly think that CEOs should largely be focused on running their businesses, building great value for their shareholders, for their stakeholders, the stakeholders of their customers, their employees, being beacons of leadership and success in their communities. And when there are issues that directly affect their employees or their customers, yes, they should speak out. It's a direct connection to their interest of their business, their interest of their shareholders. But I think having CEOs sort of beating the podium and talking about all the range of issues in front of us today is a really slippery slope. I think it's distracting from their primary responsibility. I think it puts CEOs and business leaders in the public ring, where the answers are highly politicized in many cases. And I think the ESG investing arena is a perfect example of where this happened, where I think the private sector, some of the key investment firms, BlackRock and others, they went too far, and they were promoting ESG investing. We could talk about what's good and bad about that, but in a way that a lot of the people that were affected by it didn't agree. So if you're in a pension plan in Texas, you may not want your pension, which you spent your whole life assembling, allocated in a certain way that may sacrifice some of your return to promote climate agenda. That's your choice. That's your pension, right? So it's a slippery slope, and putting the right barriers on it, right restrictions on it, is very, very challenging. So, we need to run companies with quality and opportunity and fairness and all those great values. But I think CEOs putting themselves in the political sphere with regularity comes at real peril to them, but also to our capitalist system.
And maybe we can ask just a final question and close here, since we're getting close to the hour, and turn it back to political and policy and government leadership. So you've laid out in this book, you've laid out a diagnosis of the situation the United States is in. You've laid out a set of prescriptions for what we need to do to renew the sources of American strength, to compete effectively in the world, to make the country a better place. But all of that requires a whole lot of leadership. And as you look around, where do you see that?
Yeah, well, there's, I sort of got to that. The book was an evolution, because I'm going to write the greatest policy book ever. And then the publisher said, nobody's going to read that book. You got to make it more interesting. So make it more, some of your personal stories in it. And then we got my colleague and I, James Cunningham, who, by the way, I should say, was a huge part of writing this book and a real saint and a great partner. We got to all these policy prescriptions and we said, well, if we don't have the right leaders, none of this matters. Good ideas alone without leaders to pick them up and take them forward is not going to take us very far as a country. And so we talk about leadership. And, I see it every day, little sparkles of great leadership, but I don't see it holistically enough of it at the country level. And there's libraries full of books on leadership, but I try, James and I try to lay out 4 things, the elements of leadership that we think are most essential. And we use some historical references and talk about them. But leadership is particularly important in transformational moments where the future of the country is at risk. Henry Kissinger just wrote a great book that highlighted this. And we talk about vision, a clarity of vision about what's unique about America and the path to take it forward. We need that first and foremost in our leaders. We need courage. We talk about, the courage to run up the battlefield and run into enemy fire, but it's not that kind of courage. It's courage to stand tall. There's no idea today in public life that doesn't have, almost half of the country disagreeing with you. So to stand tall on principles and promote ideas that they're going to take America forward is a hard thing to do. We talk about humility and that the humility to learn from your mistakes. No leader's perfect. And in that, I talk about my own experiences, including, I was very, very prominent role, CEO of Bridgewater, and got fired. And it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and then later, a few years later, came back as the CEO. But boy, that ability to learn from your failure, and we've had plenty of failure in American history that we need to learn from, but also have the confidence to persevere through that is critical. And then the final thing, which seems so obvious, but maybe is what's most lacking today, is just a fundamental caring about people, a selflessness. We need first and foremost the people in the public arena, in all realms of leadership, but in the public arena, most important, it's selflessness. It's not about you. It's about the greater enterprise of America or the company you lead or the military unit. And we just don't see that level of selflessness to the degree we should, and people aren't explicit about that. And I think that's what's going to be required to take America in the right direction. And I'll end by saying on the campaign trail, quite the opposite. You hear all the things that, are the elements of decline that I described. But then you hear the resilience, the belief in America, the belief that we can do better, the commitment to doing their part. And I've got a lot of confidence we'll find our way through this and we'll find the right leaders, but it may take a while.
That's great. The book is called Superpower and Peril, A Battle Plan to Renew America. It's a fantastic book, and I recommend that everybody take a look at this. It's extremely thought-provoking, a very comprehensive and incisive plan, and just a really great diagnosis of the situation in the country and in the world. So recommend it to everybody. Dave, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for everything. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.